G'day guys! One of the biggest challenges that new players face is rules bloat in Warhammer 40k. There's so many books, so many rules, each one of them with so many sub-factions, stratagems, warlord traits. There's just so much that people need to wrap their heads around that some people think this is one of the biggest problems with Warhammer 40k, and they hope that 10th edition will bring greater restrictions on the options available, which will reduce bloat and make the game more accessible. Well, I'm here to share my controversial opinion, and that is that rules bloat is not the problem with Warhammer 40k, and that those rules complexity is actually the thing that makes 40k so amazing, and it's one of the things that we should appreciate and love about Warhammer 40k. So in today's video, I'm going to lay out my arguments for why this is the case, and then let's have a conversation in the comments below so you guys can share your opinions. So this is obviously an opinion piece. I'm not claiming to have all the answers here, but I do have some interesting sort of perspectives on these sorts of things, and I would love to have that conversation with you in the comments below. So with that being said, let's just jump straight into the video.
Welcome to the Black God!
G'day guys! There is no doubt that there is more rules bloat in Warhammer 40k now than there has potentially ever been, with the amount of different codexes that are out there, all of the different combos of warlord traits, relics, stratagems, sub-factions. There's just so many different options that people need to wrap their head around in order to remain competitive in the current edition of Warhammer 40k. And we're seeing rumours for the next edition, and we're seeing some sort of signs for the new direction that Games Workshop is taking the game, which is basically reducing the number of stratagems and warlord traits, etc., that are available to each faction, with the design philosophy that less is more. And there's a lot of people online that think this is a fantastic thing, right? Because then there's less things that you need to try to remember, less things that you need to wrap your head around, and that makes the game more streamlined, more accessible, easier for new players, and also provides, less opportunities for the experienced players to gain some kind of ridiculous advantage by coming up with these combos that, sort of break the game, so to speak. So there's a lot of people that really like this new direction. But I think there's something that they're missing when they're looking at this, and that's what I want to talk about in today's video. So the idea of less is more, I actually don't think that applies, and I don't think that works in a game like Warhammer 40k. It works in lots of games, and yes, absolutely, in lots of scenarios that is true, but I don't think that's the case in Warhammer 40k. So the analogy that a lot of people are using is it's like a buffet, right? Like, what's better, having 50 options of different food at the one place, or a food court, for example, or having a restaurant that's stripped back their menu to just 3 meals that they do really well. And that analogy makes perfect sense in the context of like a restaurant, but in Warhammer 40k it doesn't necessarily make sense, because and one of the reasons that people are advocating for this stripped down version of 40k is because some armies have these really, really powerful stratagems or really powerful sub-faction bonuses that just they sort of ruin the game for the narrative player, because maybe one of the legions in your book is really, really powerful, and it's like, okay, well, why would you ever take the other legions? It doesn't make sense, which then means if you happen to play one of those legions, it feels bad. Like if you're a Night Lord player at heart, it kind of feels bad because you're like, but every other legion is just better. Black Legion is just better in almost every way. So it kind of feels bad. And that checks out. That makes sense, right? But I think the solution to this is not to strip the game back, but it's actually to dial this up even further. And the reason that I say that is because GW have proven time and time again that they're not really able to determine what's going to be broken or what's going to be overpowered when they write the book. I don't think they're conscious of this, and I don't think they have control of this. I think they just sort of write a whole ton of rules, throw them at the wall, and see what sticks. And the problem there is if you strip that back, the chances of each faction getting an equal representation of powerful rules goes down. Whereas if you dial it up, the chances of each faction getting equal representation of powerful rules increases. And to illustrate this point, I want to make an extreme example, right? So bear with me, it's going to sound a bit ridiculous. But let's imagine two different scenarios. One of them where there is 10 factions, each of which have 10 warlord traits. Let's just use warlord traits for this example. So 10 factions, each of which have 10 warlord traits. And then the other scenario is there's 10 factions, but each of them have 100 warlord traits, right? So in one scenario, you have 100 warlord traits spread out across 10 factions, and the other scenario, each individual faction has 100 warlord traits, right? Now let's imagine that when GW are writing rules, 5% of them are overpowered, like game-breakingly good, like Lord Invocatus style pre-game move and +2 to move combo, crazy good, right? And then 5% of them are unplayably bad, like they actually give you some kind of disadvantage, like it's a replace a weapon with a weaker weapon, or it's, you know, something like that, where it's like you would just never in a million years choose to take this thing, right? And then the other 90% of them are just kind of meh. You know, they're good in some scenarios, they're bad in others. You know, maybe they're good, but they're, you know, they conflict with something else that you already get that's already kind of good anyway, so it doesn't really matter. That sort of stuff, right? So 90% of them are meh, 5% are OP, and 5% are garbage. Now, if you go, okay, cool, we've got one faction that has 100 different rules, right? 100 different warlord traits. Then based on those maths, that faction is going to have 5 OP rules, 5 garbage rules, and 90 rules that are just kind of meh and whatever. Whereas if you go, okay, we're going to actually have 10 warlord traits per faction. So we're going to have, you know, 10 and then 10 Space Marine ones, 10 Chaos Space Marine ones, 10 Eldari ones, for example. Now, when you apply that same distribution of power, that means you're only going to have 5 powerful warlord traits among those 10 factions, which means that chances are 5 factions are going to have an overpowered trait and 5 factions are not going to have an overpowered trait. And that creates an imbalance between factions. Further to this, there's a decent chance that what's going to happen is 1 or 2 of them are going to have 2 overpowered traits, you know, and then 1 or 2 of them are only going to have 1 overpowered trait, and then you're going to have 6 or maybe even 7 factions that have no overpowered traits. And that's based off a 5%, you know, distribution of overpowered traits. And then the same applies to the underpowered traits. So it's entirely possible that you end up with one faction that has 2 overpowered traits and no underpowered, and another faction that has 2 underpowered and no overpowered. So if you have 100 options and you distribute them evenly among 10 candidates, you are going to create imbalance. Whereas if you give every candidate 100 options, well, now, based on a 5% accuracy of making powerful rules, then every faction is going to have 5 OP traits, which means that every faction has a viable build. Every faction potentially has 5 different viable builds because you've created all of these powerful combos. So I think the solution here, instead of going, okay, currently most codexes have, like, you know, say 18 odd warlord traits, you know, because there'll be the 6 basic ones, and then there might be 12 to 18. So they might have 6 basic ones, and then they might have, you know, 2 for each specific sub-faction or something like that, right? Either way, there's 12 to, you know, 24 warlord traits in each codex. If you strip that back to 3 to 6, the chances of each codex getting something that actually works is really low. Whereas if you increase that and go, instead of going 12 to 24, let's go 24 to 50, let's double it, the chances of every codex getting something that actually works increases. Now, there's a few challenges with this, obviously. One of them is that then you've got a lot more, you know, options that you need to wrap your head around, which becomes a little bit more of a daunting task for newer players. And it also means that, you know, there's just so many more rules to know, so the chances of your opponent being able to pull a gotcha on you, you know, arguably increases. But I think this is a pretty easy challenge to solve, and that is to make all of these warlord traits and relics and stuff, make them much more universal. So you might have one of them is called like crack shots or something like that, and that is the character gives an aura, 6-inch aura of 6s to hit, automatically wound. All right, so you call that one crack shot or whatever, and you make that one available to like a whole bunch of codexes. So not every warlord trait needs to be unique, I guess, is the key here. So you make 100 traits. Maybe what you do is you got 10 factions, each of them have 100 traits, but you have 80 universal traits that everybody gains access to, and 20 in each codex are unique. And that way you only really need to make 200 unique warlord traits. And if you do that, then when people are looking at it, they're like, cool, these 80 are the generic ones that everybody has access to, and maybe they don't even go in the codex. Maybe they go in the Nephilim pack or the Arcs of Omen pack or whatever, and that way they can, each season, they can update them and cycle them in and out and change them as they need to. But if you make a whole ton of warlord traits that are unique, that are universal, able to go anywhere, and you put those in that book, well, now you've made it so that people can read those, have an understanding of those, and now none of those will be a surprise. And then you just give a few unique ones to each faction. And the other thing about this is, for me personally, one of the most exciting and fun parts of Warhammer 40k is the role-playing aspect. It's like one of those, those games where you level up your characters and you pick their traits and you go get their gear and all that sort of shit. That's how I approach list building, right? Because it's kind of like, okay, here's all the options. You get to pick your archetype, pick what kind of faction you want to play, which is kind of like picking your race in one of those games. Pick what archetype you want, which is like picking your class. Pick all your your gear and your upgrades and what combination of units you want to bring. Like, it's a real creative and exciting exercise. And one of the things that I've felt really, really strongly with this World Eaters release is that that's absent. It feels like there's very little creativity when it comes to writing your lists. It's really like the differences between each list is limited. They all kind of feel just the same. One of them might have some Exalted A-Bound, the other one have some like Terminators, but it's more or less the same fucking list, So it just feels like that creative expression in list writing is gone. Whereas if they increase, and that's because they've reduced the number of rules, it's because they've reduced the bloat. Whereas if they increased the bloat and went, cool, the World Eaters Codex has come out and it has 8 sub-factions, and each of those 8 sub-factions has 8 warlord traits and 8 relics. And it's like, whoa, that's crazy. And then another 8 stratagems per sub-faction. So you got 64 stratagems in the book. It's like, that's crazy, right? That's so many rules. But a lot of them would be bad, and you'd read it once and never listen to it again. You'd be like, yep, no, never, don't care. That can be used for campaign play or narrative play or whatever, Crusade games. But for competitive games, it doesn't matter. But there's a decent chance that in those, there's going to be, at least 1 or 2 good relics, 1 or 2 good strats, 1 or 2 good warlord traits. And that makes a really exciting and creating challenge when it comes to writing your list, because you look at it and you're like, okay, well, which one of these sub-factions is the best? Maybe the Bloodbound sub-faction has the best warlord trait, and you're like, wow, that's really good, I want to build around that. But, the Skullsworn or something like that have the best relic, and it's like, okay, well, now you actually have an interesting challenge. You have to try to figure this out. Whereas with the current system, it's like, okay, well, you just take none of the warlord traits or relics because they're all garbage, which is what's going to happen to every codex when they reduce the number of warlord traits and relics. Either that, or one of them will be good. And you'll be like, okay, well, everyone just obviously takes that one. Whereas if you increase the number of warlord traits and relics, you're going to increase the number of them that are good, and therefore you're going to have a really good time trying to figure out, which one of them do I want to take. There might be another one whose faction-wide, like their sub-faction bonus is really good, but they have no good warlord traits or relics, and it's like, oh, geez, what do I do here? And this is how I've felt with the Chaos Space Marines Codex. You look at it and you're like, okay, well, there's the Emperor's Children have the really good sub-faction bonus, they have a really good secondary, they have really good, but at the same time, Black Legion have a really good relic with the Veilbreaker plate, and they get more utility out of Abaddon, and they get, and then they got really good stratagems, and it's like, so you have this really interesting and challenging puzzle to solve, which is really fun. Whereas with World Eaters, it's like, it's not fun. There's no fun to be had in list writing. There's just, how many 8-bound do you want? Or do you want Berserkers in Rhinos? That's really the only question. Do you want Angron leading Berserkers in Rhinos? Or do you want a Lord Invocatus leading 8-bound? That's your decision. You make that one decision and you're done. From there, the list writes itself. Whereas, go to write a fucking Chaos Space Marine list, and it's like, oof. The first decision is pick one of these fucking 8 legions. It's like, Jesus, it's already more options than the World Eaters, and you've only got to the first step. And then within those legions, you're like, okay, well now what do you want to do? Like, what unit combos do you want? There's so many options. So yeah, I just think that there's a lot of people that are complaining about rules bloat, and they've misframed the challenge. They've framed the challenge as there is too many rules, but the challenge is actually that the rules are not universal enough. That's the real challenge here. If they made the rules more universal, so there's like, Furious Charge might be one of the sub-faction bonuses, and it means that everything in this army gets +1 to charges, advances, and, +1 strength on the first round of combat or something like that, right? And you make that's called Furious Charge, and it's like, this one's available to, it's this same rule, called the same thing, called Furious Charge, is in the World Eaters book, it's in the Blood Angels book, it's in the Space Wolves book, it's in the Raven Guard book, it's in the Orc book, it's in the, Eldari book, like, it's in all of the books, right? And that way, you've given that option to everyone, so people will be very familiar with it, they'll know what it means, they'll know what it does, and if it's overpowered, well, that's okay, because lots of people have access to it. And if it's garbage, well, that's also okay, because everybody has access to a whole bunch of other stuff. And then you make another one, which is like, 6s to hit in shooting auto wound, and that's available to Iron Hands, that's available to Iron Warriors, that's available to Orcs again, because, they've got some kind of army that's themed around shooting, that's available to Tau. You make a whole bunch of those, and you make one that's exploding 6s to hit in shooting, one that's exploding 6s to hit in melee, one that's, -1 to enemy morale if they're within 12 inches, just, you make all of these sort of generic, simple kind of non-specific warlord traits and, sub-faction bonuses, and then you just give everybody access to them, You have a stratagem to make an enemy unit within 3 inches of a character fight last, like what Emperor's Children have, but you just give it to fucking everyone. Give it to tons of people. And then people will be familiar with it, and it won't be a gotcha moment, because people will know that that is out there, that is in lots of armies, and therefore you'll be used to it. Whereas at the moment, there's only like 1 or maybe 2 armies that have that, and as a result, it's a gotcha. People don't see it coming. Like, one of the things that I get people with often is the Mark of Slaanesh in the Chaos Space Marines book, which allows you to, when your opponent falls back, you can advance, you can consolidate and chase them down, right? Now, I tell them at the start of the game, I'm like, this is the strat that I have access to. I can use it on my Terminators, or I can use it on Abaddon, or, etc. I explain it to them. But then by the time we get to turn 3, so much has happened in the game. There's all this crazy stuff happening. They've completely forgotten that relic is a thing, that stratagem is a thing. They've forgotten that that's a thing. And then I do it, and they're like, fuck, that's such a gotcha moment. And then what a lot of people are saying is the solution is removing that option. But I'm telling you that that's not the solution. That makes the problem worse. The solution is giving everybody that option. If they go, okay, cool, everybody now has that, or maybe there's like, out of the, say there's 15 factions, out of those 15, 10 of them have the ability to do this, And if you do that, it's like, okay, well now you've got 10 factions that have it, so everyone's going to be familiar with it, because either their faction is going to have it, or their best mate's faction is going to have it, or they're going to experience it. Either way, everybody's going to be familiar with it. Whereas when it's something that only like Harlequins and Chaos Space Marines have, and even when it's Chaos Space Marines, only Mark of Slaanesh Chaos Space Marines have it, it's completely understandable that people don't think about it. It's completely understandable that people forget that this is a thing. Another one is like Blood Angels and Sisters of Battle have a stratagem that means when one of their characters gets into melee with you, everybody within engagement range can only target that character. So, heroic sacrifice or angel sacrifice. And it's like, that's fucking cool. And the amount of times that I've seen people get really mad because they charge something and then a character like heroically intervenes in and then makes it so you can only fight the character, and it's a character that you weren't planning on killing. You were you were prepared to let that heroic intervention happen because you were going to kill their objective secured unit that was on an objective, and then you were going to take it. And then they heroically intervene, make it so you can only fight the character. Therefore, you don't get to kill the objective secured stuff, which means that they still hold the objective, and it's a big disaster. And they get really mad because it's such a gotcha moment. They didn't think about that. Because who the fuck would? Because there's very few factions have the ability to force you to hit a specific thing. And as a result, that leaves people with a foul taste in their mouth. Their proposed solution is to remove that stratagem from the game. But I'm telling you, if you do this and you encourage GW to arbitrarily remove half of the thing, like if they Thanos snap it and just remove half of the stratagems, that's bad, because the chances are they're going to remove all of the good ones from your faction, but they're not going to remove all of the good ones from somebody else's faction. And then all of a sudden the imbalance is actually worse than it was now. Whereas if they instead went, okay, cool, we're going to give that, heroic sacrifice or that angel sacrifice, we're going to give that to 10 out of 15 factions. That's huge. And people will push back on this and say, well, that sort of takes a lot of the flavor out of the game, because if a lot of the stuff that's currently unique and exclusive becomes universal, well, that takes a lot of the the flavor out of the game. And I disagree. I think that it actually enhances the flavor because it does a few things. One, it allows you to come up with more combos, more unique combos, right? Because if everybody has access to all a ton of stuff, well, but everyone's obviously still got different units. So you can come up with a combo on your World Eaters stuff. That same combo applied to an Orc unit is very different. So I don't think it necessarily takes the flavor out in that regard. And it also just means that you get to choose your flavor, You get to pick whichever flavor you want. So that's just better. It's got to be better. And if anybody who's trying to write a World Eaters list right now can absolutely attest to the fact that there's only two flavors. There's chocolate or vanilla ice cream. And it's no, I want caramel. Where the fuck's the caramel ice cream? What? That boy gets it. That boy gets caramel ice cream. That boy's got fucking, Ben and Jerry's. He's got 30 flavors. This is bullshit. Having more options is it's always better, and it always restores balance. That's what creates balance. And I think this is it's probably a mathematically provable principle, right? Because for example, if you multiple instances flattens out the variability of the result. That's a fact of mathematics. So for example, if you just roll a single dice, it's impossible to roll an average result, because an average result on a single dice is 3.5, right? So if you roll a single dice on its own, you can't actually roll a 3.5. And that's because half the time you're above 3, half of the time you are 3 or lower, right? So half the time you're 4 or higher, half the time you're 3 or lower. So halfway between 3 and 4 is your average roll, which is obviously not possible to roll on a d6, and that's probably why the dice ends up cocked so freaking often, because it's trying to be average. But anyway, my point is that if you roll a single dice, you can't roll an average. But if you roll that single dice 1 billion times, you're going to get 3.5 billion is going to be the total sum. It just is going to be that. The more times you roll it, the more likely, because you roll 2 dice, and now it's I don't know, it's 35 or something % of the time that you'll roll exactly a 7, right? So you've gone from being impossible to roll an average result to being a third of the time you will roll exactly the average result, and then the other 66% of the time, or whatever it is, you roll above, and the other, or below, So I'm not 100% sure on the maths there, so somebody's probably screeching in the comments about how I fucked that up, but the principle that I'm getting at is that, if you roll a single dice, you can't roll average. If you roll 2 dice, you will sometimes roll the average result. If you roll 3 dice, now your average is 10.5, right? You'll never roll that average, but you'll often get quite close. If you roll 4 dice, your average is 14. Now, you will get that, I think it's something like 50% of the time. Like the number of times you'll roll a 14 on 4 dice is higher than the number of times you'll roll 7 on 2. Because the more dice you add to the equation, the more likely you are to roll the average result. Which is why if you summed up the numbers of every dice you roll throughout a game, you will actually find that you did roll average. You almost always roll average. The rolling bad part of 40k is when those rolls happen. You'll almost always roll as many 1s as 6s, but if you roll all your 1s are on your 2-up saves and all your 6s are on your 2-up saves as well, you're only going to notice the 1s because the 6s don't mean anything to you, right? So where you roll those 1s and 6s is what we feel as luck, but realistically you are going to roll the same number throughout the course of the game. And this is the reason that this is an important point to make in regards to rules bloat, is that the more instances you have, the more those results average out. And I think that's how rules are going to work, is the more access to rules that people have, and the more options of rules people have, the more they're going to flatten out, and it's going to become much more balanced of a meta. So yeah, so that's, I guess, the principle that I wanted to talk about today, is that, all of those people that are complaining about rules bloat, I think we need to redirect our complaint and say, instead of saying, well, there's too many rules, say there's not enough access to the rules. If they just took every stratagem and every relic and every warlord trait that's currently in the game and then just made them available to everybody, the game would become instantly more balanced, because all of a sudden, whatever that really busted thing is that one faction gets, well, now everybody gets it. Everybody gains access to that thing. So now it's not that problem, because if it's really, really good, then everybody can take it, and then it's not a problem. The current problem that we're experiencing is that it's very selective, and only certain people have access to certain things, and that's what creates imbalance between factions. That's what makes some factions busted. Like the Black Rune of Damnation is busted because only Chaos Space Marines can take it. If that was available to everybody, well, then everybody would start taking it, or people would realize this is something that you need to factor into your list. Like, how are you going to beat something that has the Black Rune of Damnation? So people would start taking more mortal wounds. And then you'd see this natural evolution in the meta, where people would be like, cool, I'm taking more mortal wounds because the Black Rune of Damnation is so prevalent. And that would give you an advantage against the Black Rune. So people would go, okay, well then there'd be a rise of mortal wound output, which means there'd be a decline in Black Rune prevalence, which means that then people would start taking things like a 4-up Feel No Pain against, or a 5-up Feel No Pain against mortal wounds. Everybody would start taking that. And then you'd see, okay, well now that that's come up, there's protection against mortal wounds, so people are going to start just pivoting into high damage and high AP weapons. And then people go, okay, cool. Well, now if people are bringing high damage, high AP weapons, well, maybe neg 1 damage as an army-wide buff becomes, or a warlord trait or whatever, becomes more prevalent, And it basically, you would see this naturally evolving meta that would be exciting because of the number of options. Whereas if we limit the number of options, you're not going to see that evolution. That's just not going to take place, because it's going to be 100% controlled by what's available to the factions, not by what players choose to do. You want freedom of choice, and freedom to come up with combos, and freedom for the meta to become what it wants to become. Whereas you're not going to get that if we have, the top-down sort of restrictions on our options. So yeah, I just wanted to share that with you guys, because I think a lot of people are getting this wrong. Tell me if you think I'm getting it wrong. I would love to hear your opinion on the matter in the comments section below. As always, thank you very much for tuning in. I really enjoy doing these little conversations with you guys. We get some really good stuff done in the comments below. If you'd like to show your support for the channel, you can do so over on Patreon. We do monthly giveaways over there. We do coaching and training on the Discord server. We do, all kinds of things. Patreon exclusive dice. I'm working on a new batch right now that's going to come out soon, which is really exciting. And yeah, there's lots of really cool stuff happening over there. You can also pick up a t-shirt off my Teespring account, which is links in the description, or some neoprene objective markers. Every one of those that I sell, I get a couple of bucks, so that all goes towards getting better equipment. I need to get a better camera, a better microphone, so when I'm recording on the drive like this, there's less road noise. I've got lots of things that I want to do with this channel to increase the quality for you guys. But yeah, I need your support to do so. So any support that you guys show through any of those means is very much appreciated. And yeah, thanks for tuning in. I'll see you in the next one. Cheers. Alright guys, I hope you enjoyed that. If you did, make sure to like, subscribe, comment, all that good shit. And also head over to our Patreon where you can get Patreon exclusive dice. I do coaching and training sessions. We'll talk through lists. I'll help you strategize. We also have apparel like the shirt that I'm wearing now. You can pick them up there. There's also neoprene objective markers. And we have just launched neoprene battle mats. So we've got all your bases covered over in that Patreon. So make sure to check that out. Huge thank you to those who already have done so. You help me improve the quality and content and in the frequency of the content and all of those sorts of things. I very, very much deeply appreciate your support. And yeah, I look forward to joining you in the Patreon Discord for some conversations post video. So thanks for tuning in, guys. I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.
Bloat to the Blood God.